suggests that while foreign interest rates have begun to inch up, these rates have remained relatively low. Thus, we see the 6-month LIBOR settling at 0.3 to 1.5% for 2014 and at 1 to 2% for 2015. Sixth, and finally, on merchandise trade, we expect full year 2014 exports and imports to grow by 6% and 9% respectively. Demand for major export commodities in 2014 is expected to be driven by manufacturers, fruits and vegetables, other agro-based and petroleum products. For 2015, export growth is seen to be driven by relatively stronger performance in manufacturers as well as continued robust growth in fruits and vegetable exports. For imports, growth in 2014 will be supported by anticipated improvement in the importation of raw materials and intermediate goods, capital goods, higher crude and other mineral fuels, and rice imports. Imports in 2015 are expected to be supported by a stronger capital goods imports as power plant rehabilitation will continue and increased imports of raw materials as the anticipated implementation of projects under the PPP program is expected to gain further ground. Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the Committee on Appropriations, the BSP is endorsing these macroeconomic assumptions. Now, going forward, we recognize some major challenges, and these challenges have been discussed earlier, such as the ongoing policy normalization in advanced economies, escalation of geopolitical tensions, slowdown in the Chinese economy, and natural disasters and power outages. Given the challenges that have been enumerated, allow me to highlight our policy thrusts. First, the BSP remains committed to safeguarding the inflation targets, in line with our primary mandate of promoting price stability conducive to a balanced and sustainable growth. Second, the BSP will continue to undertake reforms and measures to further strengthen the domestic financial system and help manage risks attendant to financial market developments. And third, the BSP will remain supportive of policies that will cushion the economy from external shocks, including that of maintaining a market-determined exchange rate, keeping a comfortable level of reserves, and keeping the country's outstanding external debt manageable. That concludes my presentation, Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Tanco. The Chair acknowledges the presence of Senator Recto, or Senate President Pro Tem, as well as Senator Ginggona. Secretary Bal?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Governor Tanco. We now ask that Secretary Purisima be recognized for his presentation, Mr. Chairman.
Secretary Purisima, you're recognized, sir. You may proceed. Good morning.
Honorable Senate President, Honorable Chairman and members of the Senate Committee on Finance, good morning. My presentation today will focus on the national government fiscal performance in 2013 and the first semester of 2014. I shall then tackle the 2015 National Government Fiscal Program and end my presentation with a discussion of key legislative initiatives that are critical for sustaining our fiscal health. For the third year in a row, I'm pleased to report that the total revenue growth in 2013 outpaced nominal GDP. While nominal GDP in 2013 grew by 9.3%, total revenues and tax revenues grew faster at 11.8% and 12.8% respectively. National government total revenue collections amounted to 1.716 trillion, or a revenue effort of 14.9% of GDP. This is higher than the revenue effort of 14.5% of GDP registered in 2012. The tax effort reached of 13.3% of GDP was higher than the 12.9% tax effort achieved in 2012. Tax revenue grew at a rate of 12.8%, spearheaded by BIR collections growth at 15%. The Sin Tax Law contributed significantly to BIR collections in 2013, and we thank the Senate for passing that crucial legislation. Non-tax revenues grew by 7.5% in 2013, higher than the 5.5% achieved in 2012. With improved revenue performance, our fiscal deficit for 2013 stood at 164.1 billion pesos or 1.4% of GDP. As I mentioned, the sin tax law contributed significantly to BIR performance with actual excise tax collections from sin products exceeding expectations. The national government collected 51.2 billion in incremental revenues, 51% higher than the projected incremental revenues for 2013 of 34 billion pesos. Because of the sin tax reform, excise tax collections from tobacco and alcohol products increased from 0.5% of GDP to 0.9% of GDP, reversing the downward trend in excise tax collections from tobacco and alcohol since 1999. Increased revenue efforts in the Aquino administration have led to greater spending on social service agencies. We improved the education budget by 62%, health by 203%, DPWH by 55%, DSWD by 418%, and the conditional cash transfer program by almost 600%. The passage of the sin tax law and several government reforms were critical factors in the country's achievement of its investment grade rating from all the three major credit rating agencies. After reversing nearly a decade of credit rating declines, the country achieved investment grade status for the first time in Philippine history from all the three major credit rating agencies in 2013. This allowed the government and the private sector to borrow at cheaper rates, lower debt service, generating fiscal space for government investments in social and physical infrastructure. On May 8, 2014, the country received another credit rating upgrade from Standard & Poor's, which affirmed the continued improvement of the macroeconomic environment and increased the attractiveness of the country as an investment destination. This prompted JP Morgan to note that the Philippines has been the most upgraded sovereign credit in the region in recent years. The Republic's credit default swap, another measure of investor confidence, has continued to tighten, which implies that the foreign creditors are more confident than ever in the sustainability of our public finances. The performance of our CDS, which used to be in line with those of Indonesia, has now surpassed that of Thailand, even though it's rated one notch above our own credit rating. In fact, we now share the top spot with Malaysia, a single A-rated country, as the most trusted sovereign issuer in the ASEAN region, other than Singapore. During the first half of 2014, our revenue collection continues to be double-digit. Total revenue grew by 11.2%, this time led by the Bureau of Customs at 19.5%. The BOC was able to collect 173 billion for the period January to June 2014, which is higher than the collections for the same period last year. The BOC performance is a result of the President's call for change in the BOC during last year's SONA. Several measures were undertaken, including personnel movements, the appointment of a new commissioner, 6 new deputy commissioners, and other new officials and staff. Also, new offices under the DOF were created, the Office of Revenue Agency Modernization and the Customs Policy Research Office, which are tasked to review current systems in revenue-generating agencies to increase collections and modernize operations. The movement of the post-entry audit functions from the BOC to the DOF Fiscal Intelligence Unit was also instituted. In summary, we have improved our fiscal position through a combination of improved tax effort, reduction in interest expense, more efficient expenditure, as well as support from the legislative branch, particularly in terms of the sin tax law. I will now present the National Government Fiscal Program for 2015. For 2015, the national government deficit will be pegged at 2% of GDP, which is in line with the national government's medium-term fiscal program. Tax effort will be increased to 16.6% of GDP in 2016 to be able to finance needed social expenditures as well as infrastructure investments, which we hope to reach 5% of GDP by 2016. To support the budget, the national government will raise a total revenues of 2.337 trillion, which is equivalent to 16.5% of GDP. This is an improvement from the 14.9% revenue effort in 2013 and this year's target of 15.7%. Tax effort is targeted to reach 15.5% of GDP. We are continuing with the uptrend of trajectory of our collection efforts to extend the message that we have and we continue to lay the foundation for a sustainable fiscal growth. We endeavor all of this with our commitment to stay on the path towards fiscal consolidation to keep the fiscal deficit at 2% of GDP over the medium term. For our financing program, the national government will continue to borrow predominantly in local currency to meet our funding requirements. Our bias for domestic financing is in line with the goal of reducing our exposure to foreign currency volatility and the long-term objective of developing our domestic capital markets. As of June 2014, the financing mix is 65% domestic and 35% external, which reflects a $1.5 billion global bond issuance in January as part of a liability management exercise to buy back some of our more expensive outstanding debt. The emerging financing mix for the whole of 2014 is 83-17, still in favor of domestic. The foreign component is higher compared to the initial 2014 program of 87-13 due to the inclusion of emergency loans for Yolanda recovery and reconstruction efforts. It should also be noted that we did not tap foreign markets last year in concession to the liquidity management objectives of our monetary authorities. For 2015, we are targeting a financing mix of 86% domestic, 14% external, with external debt mostly in the form of ODA support amounting to $1.45 billion and $750 million in global bond flotation. As of end 2013, the general government debt stood at 4.5 trillion or 39.2% of GDP, lower than the 40.6 ratio in 2012, an improvement from the 44.3% in 2009. Total general government debt includes the outstanding debt of the national government, the CB Board of Liquidators, Social Security institutions, and the local government units, less intra-sector holdings of government securities and those held by the bond sinking fund. This general government debt to GDP ratio is used by credit rating agencies as one of the major indicators of credit worthiness. For 2013, the consolidated public sector financial position posted a surplus of 19.2 billion or 0.2% of GDP, primarily due to PISAM's financial performance following the prepayment by NGCP of deferred payment for concession fees amounting to 57.8 billion to PISAM. With the continued lower national government deficit ratio, improved GFI and LGU performance, we expect the CPSD to remain low at 1% in 2014 and 1.1% of GDP in 2015. In 2015, the Social Security institutions will have lower surplus compared to 2014, mainly due to higher benefits payments to be undertaken by PhilHealth. To enable us to attain our desired revenue effort and medium-term fiscal objectives, we will be working with Congress on the following key legislative agenda. The first one is the Fiscal Incentive Rationalization. The second is the TIMTA Bill, the Tax Incentives Management and Transparency Act. Third is Customs Modernization and Tariff Act. Fifth is the Valuation Reform Act. And the other is a fiscal regime for mining industry. We would also be very glad to work with Congress to look at the overall tax structure of the country. I think it's time that we revisit the whole structure so that we can maintain our fiscal sustainability as well as maintain our competitiveness, especially in light of the impending ASEAN integration. We would also would like to work closely with Congress to deal with some issues that we face involving the judiciary that affect our ability in key areas to deal with our fiscal issues. For example, recently we got a ruling from the Supreme Court that requires us to pay 62 billion pesos from PISAM for labor-related issues. No? for the simple reason that the board that approved it had only three principals. No? These, I think, are important issues that can affect the fiscal sustainability of the country, and we would like to work closely with Congress on how to better manage these challenges. With that, I thank the Senate Committee on Finance.
Thank you, Secretary Purissima. Secretary Abad, ikaw na?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
You
Thank
may
you,
proceed, sir.
Secretary Purissima. With your permission, sir. Just to present the outline of my presentation, which will involve, after the introduction, key features, the dimensions of the budget and priorities. To enable government's role as facilitator of inclusive growth, Mr. Chairman, we are proposing an expenditure budget of 2.606 trillion for 2015, a 15.1% increase over 2014, and equivalent to 18.4% of GDP. This is consistent with the macroeconomic assumptions and fiscal program earlier presented. Mr. Chairman, before I proceed in the detailed discussion of the proposed budget, let me first contextualize what we have achieved so far. As already been presented, after 4 years of firm political will and unwavering determination, our economy is now on the path of sustainable growth. In 2013, we grew by 7.2%, which is the fastest in Southeast Asia. The Aquino administration's doggedness in implementing reforms has led various third-party observers to note the improved quality of governance in the country in terms of perception of corruption, competitiveness, and ease of doing business, political risks, and other governance metrics. We have grown our economy founded on our good governance platform, and as a result, as Secretary Purissima mentioned, we have now achieved for the first time in our history an investment grade rating. But despite this upbeat performance, as pointed out by Secretary Balisacan, the challenge of inclusive development remains, which means there is a need for growth to be felt, especially by the poor, thus reaping the benefits of our historically high economic growth rates accomplished in recent years. Hence, the inclusive development framework, Mr. Chairman. Through this framework, we seek to answer questions like how can we get our poor out of poverty permanently? How can we manage our country's high growth rates to make a larger dent on poverty and unemployment? How can we sustain our economic growth, which is essential to poverty reduction? We can only attain an inclusive economy if everyone, especially the poor, has an equal shot at opportunities our thriving nation can offer. Therefore, Mr. Chairman, allow you to run through some of the key features of the proposed budget for 2015. First, this budget expands with the economy. But an aggregate increase in the budget is not enough. After all, the national budget has been growing over the years, but the poverty situation had remained. That is why, Mr. Chairman, this administration has not only been increasing public spending per se, but also reshaping the government's budget priorities in a dramatic way. As you can see on this slide, the social and economic services sectors as a percentage of GDP has increased to 6.8% and 4.9% respectively, from 4.1 and 3.1% a decade ago. Meanwhile, we have decreased interest payments from 5.3% in 2005 to a mere 2.6% of GDP. Similarly, to bolster sustainable economic growth, we are increasing infrastructure spending to 4% of GDP in 2015 towards 5% by 2016. Second, this budget sustains the consolidation of our finances, as already been presented. Not only have past governments been spreading resources thinly in the past, they have also left a huge burden on our people. We seek to bring down our debt, outstanding debt, to 45.6% of GDP, from 52.4% in 2010. To bring down public debt to respectable levels, the government will continue to limit deficit to 2% of GDP as envisioned in the PDP. Third, this budget is focused on social inclusion and job creation. From now to 2016, Mr. Chairman, the Aquino administration will focus on the following priority objectives and programs. First, making growth inclusive. Second, expanding our economy. Third, adapting to and mitigating the risks of climate change. And fourth, underlying all these programs is the need to continue to provide an enabling environment for inclusive development. Fourth, as economic growth and human development have geographical dimensions, so should our budget be biased in favor of localities where the most poor and vulnerable are. So through the years, economic activity has been unevenly distributed across space, thinly spread in poorest rural areas who are bustling in the richest urban centers, and the result of which is striking gaps in wealth, population density, and regional economies. To address this requires a strategy anchored on geographical convergence of living standards and the integrated, locally anchored delivery of services. The following types of provinces determined by the Human Development and Poverty Reduction Cluster have been prioritized in this budget. Provinces with high poverty magnitude or biggest number of poor households, provinces with high poverty incidence, and provinces vulnerable to shocks and disasters. Fifth, the budget continues to increase citizens' voice in the budget process. For 2015, we have expanded the grassroots participatory budgeting to cover, to engage grassroots communities and local NGOs in 1,693 cities and municipalities, resulting in 22.4 billion in locally developed poverty reduction projects. This is higher than the 8.4 billion and 595 cities and municipalities in 2013 and the 20 billion in 2014. Six, this budget increases government's accountability for results. In preparation for the 2014 budget, we push for the adoption of performance-informed budgeting, which links budgetary allocations to measurable performance targets. For 2015, Mr. Chairman, we shifted to outcome-based PIB. Aside from their major final outputs, departments' outcomes are also now featured and have performance indicators and targets. This means that departments are being assessed not only for the delivery of actual services, but also the outcomes resulting from the delivery of such services. Last but not the least, this budget supports a continued rollout of reforms to ensure the rapid and effective delivery of public goods and services. We will again propose to Congress the restoration of the one-year validity to all appropriations. We are also sustaining the GAA as released document policy to declog the budget execution process. We are likewise pursuing procurement innovations to help agencies implement their programs and projects. For instance, Mr. Chairman, we are mandating agencies to conduct pre-procurement activities for 2015 starting August 1 up to December of this year, so that contracts are awarded at the beginning of the year. To help agencies fast-track bidding processes, we allow the creation of more bids and awards committees, as well as permanent secretariats for BACs, and to hire permanent procurement staff to support these BACs. Moreover, we are supporting the early completion of feasibility studies and detailed engineering plans used as basis for procurement, including authorizing additional funding. This budget also provides ways to incentivize the bureaucracy to perform better. In addition to the PBB, we are proposing to provide a one-month performance enhancement incentive to agencies which meet their 2014 targets to promote teamwork and incentivize the organization. For those who fail to meet their targets, they will only be entitled to the existing grant of 5,000 pesos. Mr. Chairman, I now wish to present the 2015 budget level, its distribution by sector, the infrastructure budget, then the 10 departments with the highest budgetary allocation, and the program special purpose funds. The proposed 2.606 trillion expenditure program is equivalent to 18.4% of GDP, which is higher by 15.1% over last year's GAA. Around 37.4% of this amount is developmental and relates to the productive side of expenditures. The developmental expenditures refer to operation-specific component of the budget, intended for the direct implementation of programs and projects. When broken down, economic services grabbed the lion's shares of development expenditures at 50.3%, with 490.4 allocation, followed by the social services sector at 33.7%. Here's a visual on how the budget pie is distributed per sector, Mr. Chairman, comparing 2014 and 2015. Clearly, our core investments in social and economic services are increasing as a share in the budget, while our debt burden is decreasing. Consistent with our plan to increase infrastructure spending to at least 5% of GDP by 2016, a total budgetary support of 562.3 billion or 4% of GDP is allocated for infra outlays. This is higher by 27.1% over previous year's 442.3 billion, or an increase by more than 240% since this administration started in 2010. Of the total infrastructure outlays, Mr. Chairman, the government has allocated a sizable amount of 222.9 billion for the construction, rehabilitation, upgrading of roads and bridges to provide affordable transportation and to ensure access for the delivery of goods and services. The rest of the investments in infra are shown in the slide, Mr. Chairman. Presented on the screen are the top 10 departments in terms of the respective allocations in the proposed budget. Both the DepEd and the DPWH will remain as the top two departments with the highest budgetary allocation at 365.1 billion and 300.5 billion respectively, owing to the expansion of the respective banner programs such as basic education and infrastructure development. The DND completes the top three departments with 144 billion allocation, increasing by 16.9%, mainly on account of the AFP modernization program. For 2015, the DSD budget will increase by more than one-third of the current year's allocation towards 109 billion, which brings it within the top 5 departments with the budgetary allocation. Mr. Chairman, at this point, we would like to note that under this proposed budget, only 1.8% or about 48.1 billion of the total 2.606 trillion proposed budget can be considered as strictly lump sum under the special purpose funds. By their nature, these items like the contingency fund, the calamity fund, allocations to LGUs, for example, cannot be disaggregated as the specific projects to be funded by them are contingent by certain events happening or can only be identified during the period of budget execution. Releases are made only when conditions are met. Mr. Chairman, I now wish to present key priority programs to be funded under the 2015 budget, in line with the 4 priority areas that I earlier discussed. Under the social protection and social services, our first priority area, we have included investments that help us meet our Millennium Development Goal of reducing poverty incidence to 16% by 2015, and at the same time sustaining equalization of opportunities for all. The priority programs under this pillar are the Social Protection Program, the Universal Healthcare Program, Basic Education, and Social Housing. The Conditional Cash Transfer Program is designed to address chronic poverty and meet our commitments to the MDG. We will increase the program's budget to a total of 64.7 billion from 62.6 billion this year, which represents an increase of 494% from 2010, Mr. Chairman. For 2015, the regular CCT will already cover the beneficiaries of extended CCT, which was started in 2014. This will translate on estimated 509,366 children, beneficiaries aged 15 to 18. With the funding of 59.8 billion for next year, the beneficiaries will be 4.33 million families as compared to the 2014 budget support of 60.6 billion benefiting 4.329 households. Under the modified CCT, itinerant homeless street families and indigenous people shall be eligible for cash grants. Another major undertaking of the DSWD, which helps in the transitioning the poor to something more self-reliant posture, is the Kalahi Seeds National Community Development Project, which aims to empower communities to access services and participating in local planning, budgeting, and implementation so they get access to services. It has a total budget of 17.5 billion in 2015 to cover 19,352 barangays in 826 municipalities across 58 provinces. Apart from providing adequate social safety nets to our people, we continue to expand healthcare services to the poor. Through the Universal Healthcare Program, we seek to increase health insurance coverage, improve accessibility to healthcare facilities, and help achieve our health-related MDGs. The improvement of the sin tax reform law in 2013 has increased our resources to provide health services, particularly for the poor. To reduce out-of-pocket health expenses, an allocation of 37.2 billion will cover the health insurance benefits of 15.4 million indigent families identified by the NHTS PR. Considering the importance of health facilities and healthcare delivery system, 13.1 billion shall be spent to upgrade 1,242 barangay health stations, 587 rural health centers, 128 LGU hospitals, 19 DOH hospitals, and 11 treatment and rehab centers. The rest of the health services are in the slide, Mr. Chairman. Also, to help our MDGs, we continue to support our family planning and responsible parenting program with a proposed budget of 3.3 billion for the programs mentioned or listed in the slides. Education, being an essential human development investment, requires substantial funding support. To support the successful implementation of the K-12 program, Mr. Chairman, 2015 proposed budget for DepEd will continue to address concerns on access and quality. Mr. Chairman, for the past 4.5 years, the Aquino administration has doubled its investment in the education sector. To support the K-12 program, a total of 52.9 billion will cover the construction of 31,728 classrooms, 13,586 water and sanitation facilities, and 455 technical vocational laboratories and repair of 9,500 classrooms, and the procurement of 1.3 million seats. In line with the continuing modernization of education, the provision of 24,028 ICT packages will be supported by an allocation of 8.5 billion. We continue to support GASPE with 8.4 billion to benefit 1,082,798 grantees. Finally, under the social services, the 2015 budget supports the provision of socialized housing for poor Filipinos. A total of almost 11 billion will be provided in 2015 to support the provision of affordable housing. It should be noted that the reduction of the budget from 17.2 billion for this year is due to the availability of previous releases to the housing program for ISFs in danger areas in Metro Manila, amounting to 5.6 billion from previous budget releases. Similarly, an amount of 5.6 billion is available for the implementation of the AFP, PNP, BJMP, Bucor project by the NHA. In terms of program, another 2.3 billion shall be allocated for the following: community mortgage program, emergency housing assistance, and resettlement program. Our second priority objective is to expand the economy and generate more jobs. Expanding the economy necessitates a physical integration of the archipelago, primarily by connecting lagging towns to growth centers, products to markets, and people to productive areas. This is what the Transport Infrastructure Program seeks to achieve. In 2015, the DPWH commits to pave 97% of our national roads and make all the bridges along national roads 100% permanent, with a total investment of 174.6 billion. To support DPWH's effort, the DOTC is building integrated transport systems around Metro Manila to decongest the metropolis and provide seamless connection of different transportation modes. A total of 7 billion is allocated for the road transport projects. Among others are the integrated transport system for the South, 1.2 billion, integrated transport system for South Coastal, 800 million, and the North integrated transport system, 750 million. To improve the transportation of people, goods, and goods throughout the country, the DOTC will be provided with 13.3 billion for air transport consisting of airport projects. Among the major airport projects are Bicol, Indaraga, Puerto Princesa, Clark, Calibo, Iloilo, and the NAIA Capacity Expansion and Maximization Project. To address the needs of the riding public from nearby areas of Metro Manila, LRT-1 is expanding to the south, Cavite area, and LRT-2 to the east, the Rizal Province area. In 2015, this entails an allocation of 4.8 billion for LRT-1 and 2.4 billion for LRT-2. Meanwhile, MRT-3 shall upgrade its various infrastructure projects by acquiring more coaches to accommodate more commuters, reduce the long queue of riders, and improve overall railway services. The proposed 5.14 billion budget of this DOTC for maritime transport supports not only the construction and rehab of seaports, but also endeavors to improve maritime safety. The Agricultural Development Program seeks to achieve competitiveness and sustain growth in agriculture and fisheries. To achieve this goal under the Philippine Development Plan, this program seeks to increase productivity in agriculture and fisheries sector, improve its forward linkages to industry and services, and bolster the resilience of the sector against climate change risks. The DA shall lead in attaining these outcomes by promoting a condition for profitable, competitive, and sustainable agri-fishery sector. For the National Rice Program, a budget of 7.004 billion next year has been allocated. For the Fisheries Program, 4.6 billion. For coconut, 4.08 billion. And for the corn program, 2.3 billion. For the high-value crop sector, 2.2 billion, and livestock, 1.5. Sufficient resources are also allocated for the improvement of agricultural infrastructure. We will be investing 25.983 billion for irrigation, 14.5 billion for farm-to-market roads, and 756 million for fish landings, and 534 million to complete the rehabilitation and improvement of strategic municipal fishing ports all over the country. Over the years, the share of the manufacturing industry to GDP declined from 26.3% in the 1980s to 23.7% in the year 2000. This put the Philippines outside the league of East Asian successes. Thus, it's important to develop a manufacturing industry roadmap. We will support the development and bolster the employment generation potential of micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises to a budget of 874 million for the promotion and development of MSMEs. A total of 194 billion will also be invested into industry development. Efforts to be supported by this amount include the development of comprehensive national industrial strategy and specific industry development roadmaps. For R&D and extension support under DOST for manufacturing, an amount of 662.4 million is proposed to support small enterprise technology upgrading program. Meanwhile, a total of 132 million is proposed for research and development facilities for the Philippine Council for Industry, Engineering, and Emerging Technology Research and Development. As one of the strong backbones of our economy, tourism generates revenues and employment through combined efforts of tourist promotion, interconnected transport infra, and world-class service. For 2015, to attract 8.2 million international tourists and encourage 51.7 million domestic travelers next year,